By the turn of the millennium, St. Vincent and the Grenadines was a country whose major source of income was the export of bananas. Traditionally, bananas were seen as green gold, generating significant income and supporting families. By the 1990s, however, preferential arrangements for bananas were beginning to be eroded, and decisions had to be made on the future path for the country. By 2001, a new administration was voted into office, and that administration, led by Prime Minister Dr. Ralph Gonsalves, came with its own ideas and vision about the direction in which it wanted the country to be developed. It wasn't long before it became evident that education would factor most prominently into that plan. Today, 10 years into the new millennium, a dynamic, multi-dimensional education revolution has taken place, one which boasts as its achievements the attainment of universal secondary education and vast improvements in access to university and post-secondary institutions, as well as a steady move towards another milestone, the attainment of universal early childhood education. By the early 2000s, St. Vincent and the Grenadines had long since achieved universal primary education. In fact, this was so since the early 70s. Therefore, achieving universal primary education was not a goal that was necessary for the government. Where they placed their initial focus was on opening up access to secondary schools, with a view to eventually moving towards universal secondary education. Driven by the visions of the Prime Minister, the team at the Ministry of Education that would work towards achieving these goals included then Minister of Education Mike Brown, who was supported by Permanent Secretary Laura Brown and Chief Education Officer Susan Duggan. By 2003, it was this team that led a major thrust towards opening access to secondary education, with the final goal being the achievement of universal secondary education. And so in 2003, this initiative was put to the test when an additional 500 places were offered at secondary schools through the construction of wooden buildings for use as classrooms. In 2004, more wooden buildings were constructed, and 500 more students who sat the common entrance exams that year were offered places in the secondary school system. St. Vincent and the Grenadines is signatory to the Millennium Development Goals, which set out a series of milestones which are to be met at a targeted date. The World Bank had suggested that this country aim towards the achievement of universal secondary education by 2020, a notion resisted by the Prime Minister, who felt that an entire generation would be lost during this time. By 2005, 3 years after the opening of access had begun, driven by the ideal that no child should be left behind, this country had attained full implementation of universal access to secondary education. Essentially, this guarantees that each child who sets the common entrance exam gets a place in a secondary school, whether or not they have met the stipulated pass grade. It is the belief of the ministry that each and every child could benefit from universal access to secondary education.
The cognitive development of students, of everyone, is something that can be fostered. Okay, we can create the ideal environment for developing cognitive skills, for developing academic skills and so forth. And that is exactly what was done.
Universal access did not happen in a vacuum. While access was being opened, there was a robust and very aggressive system of training classroom teachers, principals, and school administrators who would then be able to provide the necessary remediation, student support, counseling, and learning support in a range of fields to meet the deficiencies of students.
So, those students who had deficits, for example, in reading, in their literacy skills, there were teachers trained in literacy. We all know the link between reading, for example, difficulties and disruptive behavior. And once we realized that students who might still be at the frustrational level of reading were being placed into a situation in the secondary school where they might experience challenges, then teachers were trained to deal with these challenges.
The link between education and development is well established. In fact, prior to the education revolution, a poverty assessment was conducted, which found that 25.7% of the population was living in indigent poverty. A study conducted this year shows that today, just 2.9% of Vincentians are living in indigence. Dr. Joel Warrican has been in the field of education for almost 25 years, with experience teaching at all levels, from early childhood to tertiary. He holds a B.Ed in Language and Literacy from the University of the West Indies, as well as an M.Phil with a focus on educational research, and a Ph.D. in Education from the prestigious University of Cambridge. Dr. Warrican has been an advocate for and an expert on universal secondary education for several years. He has conducted research on the issue both for St. Vincent and the Grenadines and St. Lucia.
When you look at the data in recent times, we have reduced indigent poverty from 20-something% to 3%. I don't think that is accidental. We cannot put a causal link to it right now, but there's a relationship. As education opportunities arise, we see indigent poverty going down. You know, that to me is as a result of distrust on education. Because all over the world, you look at all the economies, you look at the strong economies, and you will see that there is a link between the countries that are doing well and an educated populace. And to me, the way to get better to lift our society is through education. I don't think there's anyone out there who can say that education is not the way to go. I mean, that would be, in my opinion, somebody who needs to be committed to a psychiatric hospital, because education must be seen as the way to alleviate many of our ills.
There are, however, critics of an opposite view who feel that not every child can benefit from universal access.
Are they falling through the cracks, Zhinga? Would you rather see a child at school trying to decode words and trying to reason and solve a mathematical problem, learning social skills, or would you rather see that child, an 11-year-old child, a 12-year-old child, at home? Because you realize that if 100% of our children are in school being supervised by teachers and principals, if we can move a child who cannot decode a word, who cannot comprehend at 11 plus, maybe 3 years down the line, 5 years down the line, or 6 years down the line, if that student is able to achieve a certain measure of success, then we will reflect and say that we have improved that child's life chances.
The idea is that secondary education is really a stage of development, and that children should move with their peers to avoid mismatching. This is one that has evidently been embraced by the Ministry of Education. Dr. Warrican approves of the approach.
Universal secondary education is taught of along two lines. Education for secondary children is taught of along two lines. One, that for you to go to secondary school, you should master certain skills. And that is idealistic. It is good, but it's idealistic. We know that no two child learn the same way. No two child is going to move at the same pace. So we're going to have children leaving secondary school or getting ready to go into that level who do not have the requisite skills for secondary school. The question is, should we leave them in primary school until they get that requisite skill? The challenge with that is that among 5 and 6-year-olds, you might have 14 and 15-year-old students. To me, that is not a good situation.
5 years after the full implementation of the education revolution, Vincentian students are rising to the occasion and making good use of the opportunities now available to them. West St. George Secondary School is one such example. The school population consists entirely of students who did not meet the established criteria set by the Ministry for the Common Entrance exam. Yet in 2009, when that school graduated its first cohort of students, the school recorded good performances in the CSEC exams. For that year, the school received a 59.3% overall pass rate, with 100% passes in physical education and in human and social biology, as well as a 95% pass rate in electronic document preparation.
The teachers really set themselves, they launched into what they realized they had to do. They realized what the challenges were. It was not a case where a small percentage of the cohort had not passed the common entrance, so to speak. It was a case where these children had not met the standards. They had not gained at least 50% in the common entrance.
Dr. Warrican has studied the performance of students who did not achieve the set pass rate at common entrance but have entered the secondary school system and shared his findings.
What I discovered is that a number of these students did quite well on the CXC. So I matched these students to 2010, now the year when they're writing the CXC examination. And just below 400 of these students who did not pass the common entrance gained CXC passes ranging from 1 subject to 10 subjects. Now remember, these are students who normally would have been out of the educational sector, having failed the common entrance. These students were given a new lease on life. They were sent to secondary school. Beyond all hope, everybody was saying they should not be in secondary school. But it turned out that they should be in secondary school, and they did quite well.
With the move to universal access, the question of accommodating the drastically increased numbers arose. These needs were catered to in the expansion of schools program. This program would see more schools than ever constructed in a very short time frame. 5 brand new secondary schools were opened: the Thomas Saunders Secondary, the George Stevens Senior Secondary, the Bookerment Bay Secondary, the Sandy Bay Secondary, and the West St. George Secondary Schools. Replacement schools were also built for the Barley Secondary, which was renamed the Central Leeward Secondary, as well as for the Union Island Secondary and the Dr. J.P. Eustace Memorial. A new West St. George Secondary School is also currently under construction. In 1990, 2,436 students sat the common entrance exams. Just 707 students passed, thereby securing their place in a secondary school. A total of 1,729 students failed. In the year 2000, figures show 2,558 students setting the exams, and 789 of those students passing. The remaining students did not attain the required pass mark. In 2010, over 2,000 students sat the exams. All were guaranteed places at secondary schools here. The education revolution is a dynamic one, and the predecessors in the ministry achieved the milestone of universal secondary education. It is now the task of the new and young leadership to fine-tune strengths and weaknesses revealed since the move towards universal access. The ministry is employing several methods to tighten up on deficiencies and shortcomings. One method the ministry is seeking to employ is a school's self-assessment program, in which the school administration and teachers review their practices and examine how they can improve and enhance on the delivery of education. School inspection and supervision is another dimension of the improvement in education. With the understanding that not every child will be inclined to a strictly academic education, there has been a very heavy focus placed on developing the area of technical vocational education. To ensure that this happens successfully, the ministry is encouraging an attitude of parity and esteem.
I want everyone to realize that the child who can solve equations and who can do a titration is no better than a child who can bake a cake or who can build a bench. The TVET sector is just as valuable as the purely, or what we refer to as the purely academic. How do you build a bench without being able to work out the maths? How do you make a dress without being able to do the maths?
At the grade 9 level at schools throughout the country, an exam is also now offered by the Caribbean Certificate of Secondary Level Competence. It is a competency-based exam which allows for students' achievements to be measured against regional levels, which in turn allows this country to harmonize the system here with the rest of the OECS. Alongside training, the curriculum is also more varied, with support for co-curricular activities and lots of support for sports, music in schools, and the development of children's creativity. With the various initiatives that have been put in place, schools are now poised to deliver an education that is both relevant and varied. Dr. Joel Warrican admits that any focus on education cannot be one-factored, but must be a multi-pronged approach. Indeed, this is the type of approach employed by the government.
Naturally, if you put children into secondary school, you have to correct some deficiencies at the primary level, and even before that at the early childhood level. And if more students are going into secondary school, then it means that they're going to have more access to tertiary level education. So you have to put some focus on tertiary level education also. And then you can never leave out those people who had lost that opportunity many years ago, who didn't do well at primary school or secondary school and want that second lease on life. So I think the way in which this education revolution has taken place is an excellent format. It has been multi-pronged. It has taken into consideration early childhood education, primary education. We had a major project in St. Vincent called the SET project, which targeted weak students. And I know the Ministry of Education, based on the success of that project, is now having discussions as to implementing it in a much wider scale. You also have focus on the secondary level. You have focus on post-secondary. You've seen the expansion of the community college. You have seen also the thrust on adult education through the literacy crusade. And of course, you have seen the number of students leaving St. Vincent in the throes for university. Universities not only in the region, but around the world. Malaysia, Mexico, and Taiwan. There's Vincentian students all over the world. This is indeed a revolution.
Even as it fine-tunes the deficiencies in the secondary levels, there is now a drive towards attaining universal access to early childhood education. It is a target that the government aspires to in the short-term future, in an area traditionally neglected across the Caribbean.
The research supports early childhood education. The countries where early childhood education is a focus are the countries that do well in education, because there's a direct relationship between early childhood education and things like literacy rates, things like success at secondary school. In fact, the research is so clear that they found that the child who is targeted in early childhood education and given the foundation skills, that by grade 3 they see a significant difference between that child and one that didn't benefit from early childhood education?
Most of the learning of a child takes place between 0 to 3, and then you've got between the 5 to 8 range. Now remember that early childhood education is not just to be limited to that 0 to 3 age range. It goes from 0 to 8. And what research has said, the activity that takes place in the brain during the early years of the child is equal to that maybe of an adult, because after that great period of activity takes place, there's a petering off.
Gwyneth Cambridge is an education officer in early childhood education.